All right, folks, let's try this again. This is Dr. B Music Theory, live Q&A. The first attempt did not go so great. It looked like the camera was messed up, and to be honest with you, oh yeah, that's much better, much better. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for your patience. So I'm actually using the screen side camera. The front-facing camera did not seem to want to work, and so I think my mishap yesterday with water might have done it in. Actually, I was actually surprised it worked. So I'm glad that we got two cameras on these on the phones, and we can continue today. So thank you. Welcome back. So I'm going to have my chat right here on the side. So if I start looking over here to my left, my right, and down, that now you know what that's all about. I'm just looking here. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it is a lot better. I don't know what happened to that camera. I don't know if it's a goner for sure. I know that when you're dealing with more distant stuff, the front-facing camera is better. But at this distance, it's good. Hey, hello in Iran from the United States. Good. So I'm going to start off with a question from one of my Patreon supporters and one person who was participating in the live chat the first time I did it. And this was, basically it was a question that, well, it kind of started off as let me just read it. This is from Ed. He said, in lessons 37, 38, and 39, so he's referring to my lessons on secondary leading tone seventh chords. You discussed secondary leading tone chords. In your last lesson, you created a lovely chord progression using all sorts of twists and turns. My question, when linking chords, can any two four-tone chords that share two common tones be linked successfully? And because this is live and I can't flash the question on the screen for you kind of visual learners, let me repeat it again nice and slowly, because here's the question. Can any four-note chord that shares two common tones with another four-note chord, can it be linked from one chord to the other successfully? So let me answer that question, and then I can start turning my attention to the chat and keep up with you. But I want to get started. So this is what Ed was referring to, this chord progression, which was in lesson 39. In the key of D major, we had a D major over F sharp to A7 over E, A7 over G, D over F sharp, D, G sharp, half diminished 7 over B, C sharp major triad, F sharp minor triad, F sharp half diminished 7 over E, B7 over D sharp, E minor, A7 over C sharp, and D. So if we're looking at this, there's some chords that are not in the key, specifically right here and right here. And so the question is coming, it's not directly related to this, but I think it's important to really answer the question as fully as I'd like. So here are what we're dealing with this, and let's just listen to it, because we always want to use our ears. I'm going to come back to that as we're talking today. All right, so we have D over F sharp, so we're going to go. That's a great progression. You're right, absolutely right, Ed. And if we analyze it, we have the Roman numeral analysis down here. And if you want to go the step by step, do watch my lesson 39 up on my YouTube channel here. So we analyzed and we basically said, well, you know what? We're kind of like it's almost like a temporary modulation here. We're really in like the key of the minor 3, so we're really in F sharp. So this is really like a 2-5-1. 2-5-1 in the key of F sharp, and then another 2-5-1 in the key of E minor. The essence of all of these types of progressions that we're talking about right here, the essence and what makes them work has to do primarily with the circle of fifths. And that's the kind of like functionality that holds these different various progressions together. And most of what I talk about in my lessons. I cover and I teach Music Theory 1 and Music Theory 2, college level. And I've done that for well over 20 years. So I've really spent a lot of time thinking about how do you explain these kind of foundational, functional harmony. So when Ed asks his question, can any two chords? Well, let's talk about what any means, right? Any four-note chord, right? So let's start off by just acknowledging that the four common seventh chords are our major 7, our major minor 7, our minor 7, our diminished minor 7, and our diminished 7. So there are 5 types of seventh chords that are commonly used. So any two four-note chords would mean more than that. So, what else is there? If we as a quick reminder for those of you who maybe haven't seen this lesson or maybe need a refresher, this first letter in all of these examples refers to the triad type. Okay? So again, we're talking, we really have major, minor, augmented, diminished. Those are our 4 triad types. And so we have major, minor, diminished. Notice that we don't use augmented when we're talking about the common types of seventh chords, which is a little interesting. I'm going to make one adjustment to the lighting here. I think there's too much of a shadow. And I think I can fix that by doing that. I think that might be a little bit better. So thank you. All right, so you'll notice, and I think this is worth remembering, that augmented does not play into our common types of seventh chords. This is something worth discussing. So if we say, here's our 4 different triad types, this second part of the way we designate seventh chords, four-note chords, which is another way. We can call them seventh chords. Four-note chord is a specific kind of seventh chord. So 4-note chords, the big category. Seventh note chord is the smaller category. They're called seventh chords because it has a root, a third, a fifth, and a seventh. So it refers to the seventh of the chord. Let's look at what it would really mean to talk about any. We would then need to include things like the major diminished 7, major triad with a diminished 7. And if we listen, and I'm going to start playing some of these, right? So here's major 7. So this can be a little bit of ear training for those of you who talked about this on the last live stream. So major 7, major minor 7, minor 7, diminished minor 7, diminished 7. But what about, because our seventh, right? So the triad types that are open to us, traditional, and then sevenths can either be major, minor, diminished. We won't really talk about an augmented 7 because an augmented 7 is essentially and harmonically the same as an octave. And our ears don't hear an augmented 7th without some really unusual context to make that. You're just going to hear the octave, right? So we've had major 7, major minor 7. We just didn't have major diminished 7. So let's hear what that would sound like. The reason we don't normally talk about major diminished 7 is because it's essentially a major triad with an add 6, adding the 6th note. So it sounds like, and this is very common in jazz and some pop, you might see something like C major triad, C6. your ear doesn't hear that diminished seventh in that context as a diminished seven. It hears it as a major six. So sometimes we can talk about things theoretically, but the real question then becomes, what do you actually hear? Context plays a role, but in isolation, for certain, you're hearing that as a major six. So we don't really have that as a triad or as a four-note seventh chord. But what about taking our minor triad with a major seven? This is something that does exist. This sonority was used a lot to evoke kind of like private investigators in the 50s. So you'd have this kind of like, it was a dark and stormy night. Mike Hammer. And some jazz musicians will use that, like Horace Silver. So this minor triad with a major seven, that's a unusual, not one of the normal five, four-note seventh chords. So minor with a major seven is a possibility. Minor with a diminished seven, that ends up being, and let me make some room so I can jot these down so you can kind of see it all laid out in front of you. So major with a diminished seven doesn't really exist. It's really a major triad, add six. We did talk about minor triad with a major seven. This is something new. This is something that you could use, but it's not traditional. Minor triad with a diminished seven. This is another one that doesn't really exist. It's really a minor triad, add six. Then what about augmented triads? How about augmented triad with a major seven? What would that sound like? That is used also in jazz and to a certain extent in the harmonic minor. You have the raised leading tone. You could make a seventh chord based on the three chord. If you're using the harmonic minor scale, again, that's not typically used, but that's where you could find it. And you do hear this used specifically in jazz from like the late 70s and 1970s, 1980s. That's when those types of harmonies started to be really used in jazz music. People like Keith Jarrett, a lot of the people recording on the ECM record label. So we're experimenting with those types of harmonies. But how about augmented triad with a minor seven? What would that sound like? Now this usually wouldn't be referred to this. This is often instead conceived of as a major minor seven with a sharp five. Typically that's how you would conceive of it. But there's two different ways you can be looking at that. And then the last one I wanted to say, so augmented with a diminished seven. This one's interesting. So augmented triad. This is really just an inversion of this. So let's talk about the actual notes that we would have. Let's say we had a C augmented triad, C, E, G sharp, B double flat. Let's compare that to an A minor major seven. So A minor triad with a major seven. Well, let's take a look. C, C, E, E, G sharp, B double flat, A. Those are enharmonically the same notes. So in terms of a sonority, again, out of context, these are the same chords. And then very lastly, we have the diminished triad with a major seven. So we're just kind of going through all the different permutations that would be possible using a typical triad and one kind of seventh. So that would be like, and that's a sound that's used, that type of diminished sound is commonly used. That's not commonly within kind of Bach, Western European, Mozart, Beethoven, but common in terms of music that we find out in the world in various styles of music. So if I put a little blue marking around the ones that you might typically play around with that are kind of new, I would say these three: a minor triad with a major 7, really great sonority to experiment with; an augmented triad with a major 7, another great sonority to experiment with; and then a diminished triad with a major 7. So when Ed's asking any 4-note chord, right now I'm just talking about tertial harmony, chords stacked in thirds. What if we had 4 notes that were all half step away? That would be a 4-note chord. I don't think that's what he was referring to. So we're going to kind of assume that we're talking about regular tertial triadic harmony. But clarifying, when someone asks a broad question, you want to really lay out the parameters so that you can make sure you're talking as specifically and clearly as possible. All right, so hopefully that gives you a couple other 7th chords to experiment with in terms of timbre and sonority. But after that, the second part of the question is if they share 2 common tones. And so this, basically, if we're talking about our traditional 7th chords, means that, let's say we have, we have a regular 7th chord, which means it has a root, a third, a fifth, and a 7th, which means either they're sharing the interval of a third, and this is another third, and this is another third, or maybe they're sharing the interval of a fifth, or maybe they're sharing an interval of a 7th. This would also be an interval of a third. This would be an interval of a 7th. So they're either sharing some kind of third, a major third, or maybe a minor third, and they're sharing some kind of fifth, maybe a perfect fifth, or diminished fifth, which is the more common one, or they're sharing a 7th, a major 7, a minor 7, or perhaps even a diminished 7. So if they share, can you then kind of move from one to another because of the common tones and have it kind of make sense? So I did kind of experiment a little bit with those different possibilities. And here's how I kind of structured it. I'm going to erase this just so that I have room to really talk about it. If we're dealing with a major 7, we have 1, 3, 5, 7. So that means we have, and actually I think what I want to do is I want to start with, let's say that we're going to share perfect fifths. So here's a perfect fifth, here's a perfect fifth. There's 1 option, 2 option. And if we go to a major minor 7, we have 1, 3, 5, and let me call it, this is going to be a minor 7, perfect fifth, major third, right? This would be a major third, perfect fifth, minor 7. Then we still have a perfect fifth here. We do no longer have this perfect fifth between the 3rd and the 7th of the chord. Minor 7, this gets interesting, right? We have our minor third, our perfect fifth, our minor 7th. We get a perfect fifth here, and we get a perfect fifth here. So 3rd option, 4th option, 5th option. I'm looking for all the 7th chords where you could share 2 common tones. In this case, 2 common tones, a perfect fifth apart. Inverted, perfect 4th, doesn't matter. When we get to a diminished minor 7, where the root, a minor third, a diminished fifth, and a minor 7, we still have our perfect fifth interval between the 3rd and the 7th. And in a diminished 7, we're not going to have any perfect fifths in this relationships in that. So there's 6 different possibilities. And so if we just kind of say, well, what would that be? So a C major 7 would have a perfect fifth in common with A flat major 7. Where, and again, we're saying our perfect fifth, in this case, C, the pitch is C and G. We're basically going to say, well, what traditionally used seventh chords have the pitch C and G in them? And the answer is going to be a C major 7, an A flat major 7, where C and G is the third and the, I actually did a bad job of that, the third and the seventh. But it's also going to be the root and the fifth of a C7. It's going to be the root and the fifth of a C minor 7, the third and the seventh of an A minor 7, and the third and the seventh of an A half diminished 7. So if we have C and G, let's do it up. We could have a C major 7. We could have an A flat major 7. We could have a C7, C minor 7, A minor 7, A half diminished 7. And all of those chords contain the C and the G. And so then the question is, well, can I move between any of these chords because of the two common tones kind of holding it together? Well, in terms of, obviously, C major 7 to A flat major 7, those are not diatonics. So that's going to be the most interesting in terms of relation. If we say, well, if we call the C major 7 our home one, the only one that's diatonic is the A minor 7. But let's see C major 7 to A flat major 7. Now, I didn't do it with smooth voice leading, but you can kind of hear that would be a kind of a very interesting chord progression. Very much in a jazz type of sensibility. What if I were to try to do it with smoother voice leading? This becomes a little tricky because it's begging the question, what do we do with the seventh of the chord? Because the seventh of the chord traditionally resolves down by step. And when we start doing this, that's not possible in some of these cases. So the seventh then becomes something that's not, the tension of the seventh does not resolve in as expected a way as you might otherwise hear it in a lot of music. So if we have, let's say, a C major 7, and let's put up a voicing. Let's go C, G, E, B. Let's have that be our 4-chord. You know, if we're going to try to tie this in with our soprano, alto, tenor, bass writing of traditional music theory, then if we want smooth voice leading, and we're going from the C major 7 to an A flat major 7, well, ideally, since we have these common tones, we'd want to keep them, right? We'd want to keep the C. We'd want to keep the G. Then the E obviously would go to E flat, right? And the the seventh, would jump down to A flat. This creates, well, let's listen before I say what it does, right? Unless you're going for something that's really gritty and dissonant, I would say that does not work very well, even though it contains two common tones. And I maintain the two common tones. I put the A flat major 7 in inversion, but the voice leading aspect of it just sounds problematic. Let's talk about why, right? So here we have a seventh of a chord that doesn't really resolve down by step. This is really a diminished, an augmented second, which is not, I guess you could technically say it's a step, but this is not what we normally talk about when we talk about step. We're talking about whole steps or half steps. So when you talk about a major scale, whole step, half steps. We're not really talking about augmented steps. And it's one of the reasons that in traditional voice leading, augmented seconds as a melodic interval are not allowed. So not only is the seventh not resolving down by a traditional step, it is jumping an augmented second, a naturally dissonant interval. Also, G to A flat, this is a minor 9, the most dissonant interval. So dissonant. It's interesting that the inversion of, if we were to flip-flop them, A flat to G, a major 7, is nowhere near as dissonant. So maybe we can't use this voicing. Maybe we have to do something different. What if we were to not keep the common tones, but really consider this more from a voice leading perspective? What if this B in our original voicing were to go up to the C, right? And what if this C were to jump down to an A flat? The G stays and the E flat moves, right? So we don't have, we sacrifice the common tone in our bass. We compromise the smoother voice leading in our bass for smoother voice leading in our soprano. Now, our seventh still doesn't resolve down by step, but it doesn't make a leap of an augmented second either. Let's hear what that would sound like. That sounds to me like it works. And so I think the idea of saying, okay, if it's got two common tones, will it work? Not guaranteed. I think voice leading is going to play a factor. And I think, so in terms of function, I guess you could say it probably does work. And I think the reason you can say that is because of the power of voice leading. In that first example that I had up here on the board with the Roman numeral analysis, the reason that works is the circle of fifths. And that descending, because of the overtone series of music, that fifth is just such a satisfying resolution. One of the things I talk about a lot is the power of the scale, which is another way to say voice leading. And so the power of smooth voice leading, scale motion, up and down by half steps or whole steps, is another thing that the ear hears and says it's not the circle, necessarily the circle of fifths, but it's something else that really makes a lot of sense to the ear. And so voice leading combined with the common tones, I think is the way it works. And I kind of sat down and did even more work preparing to answer this question. And when I did all these kind of charts, I noticed that there are like if your common tones are a major third, let's say you're taking a major third and you want to maintain that major third and shift chords around that. In terms of the traditional 5 commonly used seventh chords, you've got 5 possibilities. And if you're talking about minor thirds, this is where it gets really interesting. You got 10 possibilities. Whereas I mentioned before, the perfect fifth, we've got 6 possibilities. So if you really want to see what your options are in terms of shifting things around, minor third is the interval to go with, right? Because if we say, well, where, in the makeup of each of these chords, where do you get minor thirds? And let's quickly do that, right? Here's a minor third between the third and the fifth of a major 7. We've got a minor third between the third and the fifth again, and between the fifth and the 7th in the major minor 7. We've got it between the 5th and the 7th of a minor 7, as well as the root and the third of the minor 7. We have it again here and here. And then this one has all minor thirds. So you really can say you got 3 options with that. If you study a lot of the diminished 7, that's commonly used by composers like Beethoven to modulate to distantly related keys. And so this minor third is really a special interval when it comes to modulating and going to distantly related chords. And it has to do with the fact that there's so many chords that share a minor third that you can say, well, I got this minor third interval, these common tones, I can then shift to something else and it still has that. And your ear holds on to that commonality as something that holds it together. So, whew, that was a doozy. Let's take a look here. And I'm sure we got a lot of things. So I'm going to go through the chat here. Let's see here. We got greetings from Mexico as well. So I got someone here writing, when sitting down to write a new piece, how do composers decide what key to write in? What goes into the decision making? And I'm going to come back. I know some of you had comments and questions relating to what I just talked about. I'll come back to it, but just for the ease of keeping track of stuff, I'm going to go through when things were posted. So Jason asks that, how do you decide? Well, there's a couple of factors. One is so how do you decide what key? Let's get some stuff up here on the board so that, one of the reasons I like to put stuff on a board is so that you can write it down, you can take a picture, you can take a snapshot. Very often when I'm teaching my classes, I'll write stuff up on the board and then I will step to the side and pose as students take out their phones and take a picture. So it's a good way to have a clear reference. So how do you decide key? Deciding key. Well, let's just talk about some of the things. And I recommend, like, you all here, this is not just meant to flatter you, but you all are a bunch of smart, knowledgeable people. And very often, you can just read through these comments on the live stream and someone might answer the question for you or pose a clarification or something. So make sure, even if I don't get to something in this, you might get your question answered or an elaboration from one of the other smart, knowledgeable people watching this. So I do appreciate that, and by all means, you're not stepping on my toes to elaborate and help clarify for people who are asking questions. Deciding the key. So if you're doing this with a singer, the range that the singer is comfortable singing in, meaning the highest note that they can sing, the lowest note, is going to be a factor. And very often, pieces, that's why in opera, you have your sopranos, you have your altos, and there's a specific range that's expected. And if you want to have like a melody that has a wide range, you don't necessarily have the choice of every key option. You might have to decide, the key might be decided. Typically when you're doing a jazz song, singers will have their own book with the songs and the keys that's most comfortable for them. They'll have their own book where it's transposed so that if they go to a jam session and let's say the instrumentalists, most jazz instrumentalists will be able to play every song in every key. But not all of them, and so sometimes just as a safety, a jazz vocalist will bring their own book where they've transposed the songs that they want to sing into whatever key, so that the range fits their voice and it rings the right way. So deciding the key might be based on the singer. It also might be based on the way in which you want to use the instruments that are being employed, right? So certain instruments sound good in certain ranges and registers. So being aware of the instruments you use. So piano, I mean, it's has a certain uniformity and a very wide range, but there's other instruments that don't. Like if you want the sound of an alto saxophone and you want a certain range, so it's really the range is very much going to be determined. So if you want a certain timbre with a certain width of range, and the wider the range, the more limitations there might be in terms of deciding the key. So instruments will help decide it, the width of the range of what you're writing. Sometimes there's a historical component. So in classical music, if you're going to write a symphony, let's say you're writing a symphony and you choose to write it in C minor, immediate comparisons to people like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is going to be in play. So there's sometimes there's a certain historical homage and reference being made. Some composers and musicians believe that certain keys have a certain feeling to the different keys. So some people will argue that C minor emotionally feels different than E flat minor. There's a number of reasons why this could be. One is that historically, not everything was equal temperament tuning. So in historical times, let's say back a couple of hundred of years, C minor did sound different than E flat minor. They did not sound the same. Now with equal temperament tuning coming into play essentially in the 17th century and being used from there on out, the ratios of those intervals are the same between C minor and E flat minor to the most degree. Some piano tuners will tune things a little bit differently, knowing if they know a certain piece is going to be performed in a certain key. So the whole tuning system thing is a giant discussion in and of itself. The other aspect is where it falls in the register. And this is why you might say that certain keys have a different feeling. So when you're playing C minor, especially if it's like the way you sing, because for human beings, we all are able to sing. It's like the most immediate thing, and we all hum, sing along. So where it feels in the register for our voice. So C has a certain feel, especially when I can go down to the G. But I can't sing down to that low C below that G. I don't have that note. So my feeling is focused around this area in my register, which has a certain resonance in my head and a certain feeling. And that might be a little bit different if everything revolved around this note. This note has a lower register and it feels a little differently as it resonates in my head. So register is going to be a factor, I think, in deciding the key, range, the width of the range, the singer, the instruments, any historical references, and then lastly, considerations for the performer. Who are the performers? Are you writing for a middle school band? If you are, you don't want to make it in a key where there's lots of sharps or lots of flats, where they're going to struggle and they don't know how to play that. So the performer, let's say you're not dealing with writing for amateurs, in which case what key signature you choose is very important. Let's say you are writing for professionals, where the assumption is they can play in any key, anything. There's still certain factors that are kept in mind because you're often dealing with transposing instruments. So when you're dealing like with for example, like a band, very often they transpose and they add sharps to a key. So you'll rarely write in E major for a band, because what that would mean is the saxophones are in C sharp major. E major is really common for guitar because the open strings, it's typical tuning. So what instruments you're writing for makes a difference. Guitar, pop music, you got a lot of E major. Band, not a lot, because you got your saxophones would be going into C sharp. Your clarinets and trumpets would be going into F sharp, and it has a level of it adds a level of complexity that might not be necessary. So I hope that answers that question. Turning back here, I do save all the live videos. They're being added to a new playlist that's just going to be the live videos, and they're going to be added to my regular music theory page. So I'm going to separate them out. So I'm going to have all music theory, and then I'm going to have one that's just the live Q&As. So yeah, I'm saving them. I'm saving them. Yeah, and someone already answered that question. Thank you very much. Alrighty. Someone's going to save it. Since they know it's being saved, they can watch it later. I'm asked what was my study for my PhD. So I don't have a PhD. I have a doctorate. This is the complexities of educational system here in the United States. So I have a doctorate. The doctorate is called the big category. Within that, PhD is one form of doctorate. The PhD is typically for your more academic music subjects like music theory, music history. I have a Doctor of Musical Arts, DMA. And mine was in performance, in saxophone performance to be specific, classical saxophone performance to be even more niche and more narrow. So you might be saying, why am I watching this Dr. B music theory? His doctorate's not even in music theory. And, you know, it's ironic to me that if I were to try to apply for a collegiate position just teaching music theory, I probably would not be competitive. I probably wouldn't even get an interview because most academic institutions want someone who's a specialist in that field. It doesn't necessarily matter in most settings for most colleges that I've taught music theory for 20 plus years. They want someone who's a specialist. And I can understand that. I'm not, from one side, I understand it. I don't know everything about music theory. There's aspects of music theory. Just last Q&A, I was asked about Neo-Romanian music theory, and I was like, I don't know what that is. I have since studied and I have learned because I ask my students to do that, and I'm going to pose the same challenge. So I can talk a little bit about my journey of starting to read up and watch videos and learn about another type of analysis. So I studied Schenkerian analysis, traditional music theory. As a doctor in music performance, and not all my degrees are in performance. My bachelor's was in performance, my master's was in performance, and my doctorate was in performance, and yet here I am a teacher. So I got music theory at each stage, and typically you are expected. There's music theory practicums and big exams that you have to pass. And one of the reasons I really love sharing my videos with you all is that there's a lot of people that are in my shoes where you're not a music theory specialist, but you need to pass an exam to be able to get your doctorate in performance or a master's. You might have to take some kind of exam. And so what they're really focusing on is what I teach, which is music theory 1 and 2. So I hope that answers that question, a little curiosity for you all. All right. Mobius drummer. All right. On interval ear training, is it really, he wants to know about interval ear training. Is it really that useful when you're not hearing the relation of them in the context of a key? That is a great question. So when doing ear training, is it good to just kind of like learn how to identify intervals out of context, meaning not within a key, and how they relate into a broader perspective? Well, when I studied, if we're going to go back to my history, that's the way I was taught as an 18-year-old. Was taught to hear intervals in isolation and then put them into context. And being good at your intervals is very helpful when you start going to atonal music or 12-tone music, if you go in that direction, because there is no tonal context, and the relationships are not necessarily very logical to your ear. So then just going by interval is a very useful thing to do. I had a friend who really thought that the idea of doing that out of context was not the right way to do it. And so I kind of split the difference when I'm teaching ear training now. I try to use the major scale as a means of connecting intervals. Now it's flawed, it's not complete, because not everything fits into that major scale, and not everything is examined in that context. So I think there is some value to learning intervals out of context. There's a reason I don't have a Dr. B ear training video yet. I haven't quite, even though I've taught it for a long time, I don't feel like I've found what I think is like the most efficient, best way to learn it. So I'm going to give you what I teach with the disclaimer that I'm not sure that this is the best way to teach it, but it is a way. It does work. So what I do for ear training intervals is I'll take something like, I'll I'll play the interval, and I'll ask everyone to sing the bottom note, so being able to pick them out. Sing the bottom note, then sing the top note, and then sing a major scale to see if you can connect the two. And I start off with intervals that's possible. So we then go da 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 da, and then you sing the interval because you're going do re mi fa sol la do la, or major 6. So the steps are identify the low note, identify the high note, sing a major scale like do re mi fa sol la ti do, and then sing the bottom note. So it may be do la, and then call it the interval major 6. And the idea behind that is you're establishing some context for that interval. You're putting it in the context of that major scale starting on the bottom note. So you do have some context, and you say, ah, okay. And the idea is that when you're hearing intervals, your ear starts to fill in the scale. Because usually as you're developing your ear, your ability to sing a scale happens much earlier than your ability to sing a major 6. So you use something that's more foundational and easier to master. So step 1, match pitch. If you can't match pitch, that's what you want to work on. Step 2, learn how to sing a major scale. Step 3, start practicing singing intervals that occur within that major scale, specifically from the root up. So major seconds, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major 6, major 7. And then the final step is to do a chromatic alteration to the major scale as needed. So let me demonstrate. So all of you with great ears can put in your answer right now in the comments before I tell you what it is. See if you get it right. But that's your interval. I would say sing the bottom note, sing the top note, then try to sing a scale that connects them. Do, re, mi, fa, sol. But that's where you hopefully recognize that as you're singing this, fa is below your note, so is above the note. So it's in between fa and sol. So do, re, mi, fa, up a half step. So you would call it an augmented fourth, or if you overshot it, do, re, mi, fa, sol, down a half step, or a diminished fifth. So that's how I'm currently teaching ear training. Now, as it gets more advanced, I broaden the context to beyond the major scale, so I start taking into consideration the key and things like that. So hopefully that helps. Mobius Drummer writes, an exercises for ear training that seems to be more beneficial for me is playing a cadence in a key, then hearing a note being played, then you hear the function color of that note. That's a great method too. So you're playing something like and hopefully you hear fa, mi, re, do, fa, mi, re, do, fa, mi, re, do. And this is kind of the idea behind solfege. So the other aspect of when I teach ear training, where I'm not just focusing on the intervals, is that I play a cadence, 1, 4, 5, 1, and then we sing melodies on solfege. And the idea, and I use movable do, so that the idea is that it's always tracking the interval and its relationship to do. So you're learning the context of the note to do. And we start with scales and we get more complicated from there. So yeah, great question. So Ed clarifies his question that not necessarily for unique notes in terms of with the two common tones. So yeah, that just there's certain levels of complexity that involves. Ed, the minor thirds do offer more possibilities. Question: People describe. One more second, lost my thought. People describe chords differently. Say, for example, a major triad, major third plus perfect fifth, but then you compare the third degree to the other notes. You have another minor third. How do we know which interval should be our focus for thinking about our harmonic rules? Ooh, okay. Yeah, I think I understand where you're coming from with that question. One of the challenges is that there's so many different angles where you can think about music theory. So if we say, let's take our major triad, C, and we'll do C, E, G as just the most basic example. We have, analyzing it, this is a major third between here and here, and this is between C and E, and a perfect fifth between C and G. So you can say, okay, we're going to base everything off of the root of our chord. And that's valuable, and that's important. One step further that's a little bit more nuanced and sophisticated is to then compare the intervals within. So we've done that, but what about the E related to the G? Well, that's a minor third. And we're not even going to talk about like going up and inversions, just within that. So we could say a major triad consists of a major third and then a minor third stacked on top of that. I would focus first on everything relating to the root, but the idea of being aware of how their other intervals are related and where they occur is helpful. It is valuable. So again, it's a matter of like, this is why I don't recommend beginners start anywhere other than lesson 1 with my videos, because there's a foundational step-by-step process that's going and that's involved. And if you skip it, it just becomes overwhelming and confusing. I'm sure we've all had situations where we're trying to learn something, we don't even realize we've skipped a step. And so we're just sitting there confused, whether that be in a math class, auto repair, music theory. If we've skipped a step, we might know we've skipped a step, but we might not know. In which case we're just confused and we're like, why don't I understand this? So I think there's multiple ways to think about it, and it allows you to go in different directions in terms of how you're constructing and arranging the music. I know that's a little bit vague, but I hope that at least puts into perspective. I would start by relating everything to the root. What I did right off the bat was starting to look at the other intervals, because we're talking about how little pieces of chords could relate to other pieces of chords. And in that situation, we do need to get that level, but that's certainly a more advanced thing to look at. So the answer is, in the end, you want to know everything. The only question at this point is, what's the sequence of getting you to the place where you know everything? All right. Non-diatonic substitutions. Danny Pippin. All right, non-diatonic substitutions. Will do. Non-diatonic substitutions. All right. So let's see. Tritone substitution is something you probably have heard of. When people talk about substitutions, that often sounds like the language that jazz musicians talk in. So a tritone substitution is one of the most common. Let me give you the quick rundown of the most basic and common substitution. In a major minor 7 chord, major triad with a minor 7 on top, so a C7, you have your root, which is where your foundation comes from. You have your 3rd, 5th, 7th. Of those, the 5th we know is, especially a perfect 5th, not especially, but a perfect 5th is often implied. Just because of the overtone in series, the reason is when you hear a C, the overtone, that perfect 5th overtone is so low in the series, it almost vibrates sympathetically. It's kind of there in the note, it's implied. The pitches that really define what kind of C chord it is are going to be your 3rd and your 7th. So the root is your foundation, you need your root. The 3rd and the 7th define what type of chord you have. And if it's a perfect 5th, that's implied. So if we keep these as E, and then we, let's say, turn this B flat to an A sharp, just an enharmonic spelling, the same pitch enharmonically, not the same pitch, cold stop. Don't say that. Your music theory teacher will reprimand you. But if you say and harmonically the same, you're good to go. So if we do maintain these two, and we then drop our root, a tritone, to an F sharp, we now have F sharp as our root, A sharp is our third, E is our minor seventh. The implication is our perfect fifth. So you notice this is a tritone apart, this is a tritone apart. But the third and seventh that are defining what kind of chord you have, the sonority of the chord, those can be maintained as common tones. So you'll hear stuff like that was one chord to the 4 chord to a 5/7, a C7, going to 1. But what if we went? That's our tritone sub. Let me do it again. The progression I'm playing is 1, 4, and then 5/7/1 is, but I'm also going to be doing the tritone sub version of that. So here's the basic without the tritone sub. Now with tritone sub. And if we want to increase our voice leading smoothness, we could go to 2, and this is often, because then we get this in the bass. We get something that goes like, a chromatic descending bass line, which just sounds great. And so you can hear that if we start, instead of going 3, so let's say 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, we can go 3, 3, tritone sub, 2, tritone sub, 1. And that's, again, it's very, very common in jazz to use these tritone subs. And you can do that basically in any kind of 2/5. It's very common that you'll have a tritone sub on that 5. So that's one example of a non-diatonic substitution. Others would be, I would recommend looking at how you can do mode mixture. Essentially, mode mixture, you're subbing something from your parallel major or minor for the diatonic version of that. So that's another example. I want to be able to answer some more questions, so that just scratches the surface. I know there's so much more to talk about. So maybe on the next live Q&A, either you can put a comment here to say, hey, Dr. B, please give me another one next time around, or tune in the next time I do this, and I'll see if I can come up with another substitution for you that's easy and quick to explain. All right, D flat uses a lot of slides for trumpets. Difficult to play quickly for them. Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, someone's mentioning that the key of D flat uses a lot of slides. Difficult for them to play quickly. Yeah, like I said, knowing the instruments is really important when deciding what key to play in. Going back to one of our earlier questions. And yeah. Some people are just here thanking me for putting this out here. Absolutely, my pleasure. Yes, Danny Pippin got that tritone, and Eloisa, I'm probably mispronouncing, not worry. Diminished fifth, devil's interval. All these are true. Great. Talk about Coltrane changes and why they work. Oh boy, we got some jazz interest today. Yeah, let's talk about some Coltrane changes. So for those of you who don't know, when someone says Coltrane changes, who are we talking about? What are we talking about? So we're talking about, so let me just write this up. Coltrane changes. We're using a lot of abbreviations. We're talking about John Coltrane. We're talking about chord changes, and a specific set of chord changes that he used on the album Giant Steps, and which has the song Giant Steps, but he uses this kind of chord progression in other songs other than Giant Steps, also on this album. So what is that progression? So we got D flat major 7, and I'm just going to make sure I can remember them correctly, so give me 1 second to make sure. A major 7, C7, F major 7. So this is the heart of it, okay? In terms of Coltrane changes. So, all right. So let's talk about it a little bit, I guess, is the question, and see why it works and what's involved. Yeah, why they work. Well, that's a great question, and I think that question about substitutions before is going to be important to remember because it plays a factor. And so in Coltrane changes, it kind of like, this is kind of the cadence, right? We have a little pause here in Giant Steps, and then it goes on to another. You have the chords moving 2 beats, 2 beats, 2 beats, 2 beats, 2 beats, 4 beats. So that naturally sounds like a cadence. So we get I'm sorry. And so that when it continues, it goes B minor 7, E7, and then it starts the same sequence on A major 7. And then so that would be A major 7, C7. So it's like you start on a major 7 chord, you go up a minor 3rd, and then it becomes a 5 chord down a 5th, up a minor 3rd, down a 5th. Right? So there's things in here that are very, very traditional and tonal. E7 to A major 7, 5-1. C7 to F major 7, 5-1. And in here, this is just 2-7, 5-7, 1. Right? And then we have again 5-1, 5-1. So that's great. Then the real question, since we have so much that's normal, is what's up with this? And what's up with this? And you have the exact same thing happening. Another slightly related question, if you're going to talk about Coltrane changes, is what about this transition as well? Because that's not entirely traditional or normal either. And so the idea of this kind of, it goes up a minor 3rd. So D flat major 7, up a minor 3rd. A major 7, up a minor 3rd. And why does that work? Well, let's take a close look. So if we write out those notes, and we compare it, this A flat is going to be our G sharp, right? This C, if we're going to go for smooth voice leading, right, we'd love that to go to either the B, maybe the D, right? It could go up to the D if we wanted. The F is very close to the E. The D flat is very close to the D. So if I were looking for my most smooth voice leading, which isn't necessarily always what's required, but good place to start, right? So we have our D flat. We can achieve very smooth voice leading. So we have that kind of smooth voice leading option. That's one reason that you can kind of make this work. Coltrane's melody doesn't kind of do that. It's more jumping around. This chromatic third relationship is something that this kind of, you know, because you could say, instead of calling it E, you could call it an F flat. So you could say you're going from D flat major 7 to, normally you'd expect it to be an F based chord, but instead it becomes a F flat. So it's that chromatic median, which is something that people like Brahms and classical composers used. And so Coltrane just kind of like takes that chromatic median relationship, you know, the potential for smooth voice leading is there, and utilizes that. Now, in part, it sounds a little bit odd, but when you repeat something, your ear starts to hear patterns, right? So even though this dotted, you know, this red line here is unexpected and non-diatonic, the fact that it gets, so you have something unexpected, expected. Same unexpected thing, expected. Then you go to another key. Unexpected thing, same unexpected thing rather, expected. Same unexpected, expected. The fact that you have a balance between the expected and the unexpected, and then you have the repetition of that unexpected element. It really, like your ear says, it's able to hear that level of sophistication and put it together. Now, I should put a little disclaimer on that. When I first heard the music of John Coltrane, and the first album I heard was Crescent, which is a little bit more advanced harmonically than this was, so it was a little later on. I didn't dislike it, but I definitely did not like it. And I listened to it a year later, and I still kept practicing music and listening to music, and a year later I liked it. So what changed between that year? Well, how sophisticated my ears were is what changed. And so this kind of unexpected where I'm like, oh yeah, you can hear that, and you can hear the relationship. That might not be everybody right off the bat can hear that and understand that. At certain levels, there might be, you know, if you just haven't been exposed to that kind of music a lot, or that complexity of music, your ear might not be able to tap on in and say, oh, I hear this pattern here. And again, we're not consciously, but just subconsciously, your ear can make sense of it because it's aware. I mean, I wasn't studying John Coltrane music theory in the year that I went from not liking Crescent to liking Crescent. I just listened to lots of music, and my brain just started like unconsciously, subconsciously making sense of how these things related to each other. It was almost like, you know, you're like a child and you're learning how sound and sight work. That's kind of like what learning jazz was like for me. If we look back at the one blue line, this is a tritone root relationship. So this is going to be unexpected, but this 2-5-1 brings us right back into the expected. So I think that's a good, there's certainly more I could talk about these relationships, but I think that's the most important aspects in a nutshell. Now, one of the things I do when I play jazz is if I have, so there's a tune called What Is This Thing Called Love? This thing called love. And so it starts off, there's two sections where you have a minor 2-5. So it's not in this key, but let's say G half diminished 7, C7, F minor. But my target is F. And what I'll do is I'll play this sequence of chord progressions and just resolve to F minor. So I'll play Coltrane changes all through here, and then just jump to F minor as the resolution. And the reason it works is the D flat is the flat 5 here. So this has a lot of notes in common. G half diminished 7 and D flat major 7. We've got two notes in common, and the other notes are within the scale. This is definitely chromatic and sounds tense. This is chromatic and sounds tense. This is exactly the same chord. So we got the enough in common, tension, tension, expected, resolution. And it works great. And I'll do that in the second half where, so the first four measures has that, and then the second four measures it actually does go to, starts with a minor 2-5 and it goes to the major. So it works even better on the second four measures of the A section. So Coltrane changes have been influential not only in his songs, but in how jazz musicians can apply. Because what you want to do is, you want to figure out how you can introduce dissonance to create excitement and then resolve it. But if you just randomly introduce dissonance, it doesn't make sense, and people get really bored after they either get annoyed or they get bored. So what you're trying to do is find ways that you can introduce chromaticism, non-diatonic chords, substitutions, with the idea of creating excitement or interest, but it's got to make sense. It's got to be able to be tied together. And this is one way that John Coltrane came up with that works really well and became widely used. Okay. All right. Let's see here. I'm going to back up. All right. Why 7 notes per scale mode in an octave, in a 12 tet? I'm not sure what 12 tet means. Octave? Why are those patterns considered to be bass? Okay. So ShoesMagoo, great screen name, by the way. Let me answer the first part, because I'm not sure what you mean by 12 tet. So why 7 notes? Great question. I will not be able to completely answer that right here, right now. So here this is where some music history is good. And I think a Dr. B music history is not soon, but in the making. The wheels are starting to turn. And I like to look at sometimes music history will help explain music theory. So ancient Greece. We're talking 500 BC. We're talking starting around there, kind of going forward for a couple hundred years. They had something called tetrachords. And tetrachords were four notes. They weren't really chords. They were like little scales. And so you'd have a tetrachord. You could have different types of tetrachords. So and they would just, so this would be, if we were to analyze it with our more traditional music theory, it would be have a major second, a major third, and a perfect fourth based off of this starting one. All right. So you'd have, and I'm not even sure of all the terminology, so please forgive me, but like a major tetrachord, a minor tetrachord, and then you would link different tetrachords up. So G, A, B, C is the same kind of formula. You link it by a major second, and you could say, oh, look, there we go, major scale, Ionian mode. But you could also have where you kind of shift how these tetrachords are, like how you link them, and the type of tetrachord could also be changed. That's as far as I want to go before I say something that's completely ignorant and wrong and mislead you. But if you want to dig deeper and do some research, that's where you would start. To answer the broader question, well, why 7 notes? Why 7 notes? Or why within the octave, right? Why 7 notes within the octave? Well, there's some reasons for this. Because not every culture does that. Not every culture uses 7 notes. So there's certain cultures where your focus is on pentatonics. And you'll have things like notes is your emphasis. And there's other cultures, well, you have more than 7. We in the Western cultures will call this, sometimes we'll call it microtonal, where you have slight differences, like it's like in the cracks of the piano. So why 7? Why not 5? Some people chose 5. Some people chose more than 5. Why 7? Let me give you some hypotheses on why 7 and what 7 allows to develop. If we look at the differences between the cultures that focused on pentatonics and the cultures that focused on more than 7, these cultures focus primarily on the melodic, I'm going to use the word melodic and rhythmic and timbral and the timbre, these aspects of music. Melodic, rhythmic, timbral aspects of music. Other aspects as well. That's the focus. With 7 notes, this culture, and I think it's connected with the choice of 7 notes. I don't think this is an accident. We have a real focus on the harmonic aspect of music in a way that you don't find when you have 5 notes or more than 7. So I don't, sometimes it's a challenge to make sure you're distinguishing between causation, like is it the 7 notes that cause this, or whether it's just correlation. Whether it just happens to be an association it didn't have to be that way. That's the way it kind of plays out when you just look at this and this, but it's not a cause of the one. But I think there is a causal relationship between 7 notes and this harmonic, because you want to have enough notes and enough variety to create enough different types of chords to have a rich enough stuff to be interesting. But if you have too many notes, then there's too many combinations for the ear, and it becomes too crunchy and too dissonant when you start thinking vertically. So it's kind of like almost like a Goldilocks idea of like you want to have just enough notes to have a rich, varied, interesting set of harmonies when you kind of start putting things together, but not so many notes that it gets too dissonant, too crunchy, and is hard to really perceive and understand. So I think, why 7 notes? I think that's kind of the beginnings of the answer to that question. Look at the ancient Greeks, think about how other cultures approached this, and how their music evolved, and then say, well, okay, because, the culture coming out of ancient Greece, leading all the way through Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, has this emphasis on these 7 notes, and this harmonic aspect develops. It wasn't there at the beginning, right? But it develops, and it's able to develop in part, I think, because you have the 7 notes, which is kind of like the right amount. And if we combine that with looking at our overtone series, right? We go C, C, G, C, E, G, and we have a B flat, though it's not really in tune. We do get that C major triad very early in the overtone series. Then we kind of get C, D, and we start moving up, and we can see how this major triad is just, in terms of acoustics, is just very foundational. And I think that plays into that kind of tetrachord development of how the notes can be created in these four note segments, how they can be linked, and how things can start to function as chords. When we look at other cultures, every culture recognizes this perfect fifth. There's a lot of musical cultures where you'll hear that perfect fifth being a foundational, usually modal kind of component. It's rarer that you start hearing this major triad as your foundation. That happens in fewer cultures. All right, let's keep going. Let's keep going. We're doing good. Here's a question from Alexander. When chromatic notes were first used, what were the musicians thinking and how was it justified at the time? I understand diatonic, but chromatic seems like it breaks fundamental ideas of tonality. Woo! Another great question. When they were first used, well, it's coming back to me as I'm talking about it. The Greeks had different types of tetrachords. They had an harmonic, and I think they had one called a chromatic tetrachord. And so you had in ancient Greece, you had chromaticism. It wasn't until the Middle Ages where the Catholic Church kind of started putting an emphasis on the diatonic aspects, where there was a getting away from this chromaticism, and it's hard. We just don't have a lot of existing. We have some scraps, some vases that have like drawings of how music, but we don't really have a lot of the something by Euripides. We have little segments of Euripides. We have a few kind of fragments of ancient Greek music, but we don't have a lot. I mean, more and more is being uncovered, so there might be some new stuff that I'm unaware of, but we don't have a lot. But with the Catholic Church, we have a lot of that still documented, and we know that there was an emphasis there on diatonic. So much so that there was something developed later on called musica ficta, which is kind of like called false music, where musicians weren't supposed to write in accidentals, but they were expected to add them in performance. And the idea was that the diatonic scale was pure and holy, and that but sometimes we would have this false music where the performers would be expected to add an accidental, typically at cadences. So in medieval music, you'll hear stuff like, let's say you're going to go to this as your cadence, and it might be written like this. Let me just show you what that is so you can see it. I'll put this on a staff for you all. Let's make a little bit more room here, because we have the double leading tone cadence that is very common in the 14th century, Middle Ages. People like Moshot, de Vitry, these are the composers that are using a lot of this kind of musica ficta right before the Renaissance comes about. So if your cadence is, and then we'll bring it a treble clef here, you might sometimes see before it these notes. We're in a Dorian mode, so D Dorian. This might be written, and the performer might add this and this, all on their own. And the idea was to intensify chromatic half-step resolutions. So you get, instead of getting this, you get this. And if you listen to some music by Moshot, Guillaume Moshot, de Vitry, you'll hear some of these very, to our modern ears, it sounds really unusual and really quirky, the kind of chromaticism they use. And in part, it's because that they're always cadencing on like fifths. They're not using triads. So they don't have this idea of like the G natural going to the F sharp. And so the leading tones start leading towards the root and the fifth. So our regular leading tone, but this is why it's called the double leading tone cadence. So historically, ancient Greece, more accepting of chromaticism. They had that in some of their tetrachords. And with the Catholic Church, a more emphasis on the diatonic. And when you start getting into the 14th century, you have this kind of musica ficta, and this other aspect of chromaticism develops. And then once we get into that kind of continues throughout the centuries going into the Baroque era. Classical kind of steps back a little bit, becomes a little less chromatic in general than the Baroque era. Then the Romantic era gets back in even more chromatic. So if we're going to kind of like graph history, you know, ancient Greece, chromatic, Middle Ages, less chromatic, Middle Ages, bring the chromaticism back, keep it going into the Baroque era, classical, step it back, Romantic, step it back forward, 20th century even more. So we kind of have like this ebb and flow of how much chromaticism is used. So I hope that answers some of that question. Danny, yeah, absolutely. Next time around, I'll get to some more non-diatonic substitutions. Please tune in and remind me in case I forget. Joel asks about good theory books you recommend for the Diploma undergrad music students. I'm looking to read more on harmony, specifically for songwriting. Well, songwriting is definitely different. When we talk about most undergrad programs, we're talking about more traditional Johann Sebastian Bach, music theory, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. I use tonal harmony in my classroom, which is by Kostka and Payne. And but for songwriting, you know, to be honest, I don't have a lot of great recommendations off the top of my head for dealing with songwriting music theory. That said, the idea of the harmonies is going to be somewhat the same between whether you're writing a song for a singer or even song in the sense of a short song form for instrumentalists. The theory behind it is going to be similar between the two. So you're probably in good shape just studying traditional music theory. In terms of song, that's the difference really comes in when you're talking about how you're going to structure verses, choruses, refrains, anything of that, the kind of more of the formal aspect of songwriting. And I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I might try to take a look and see. If I have time, I'll try to take a look and see if I can come up with some good book recommendations. Just keep in mind the harmonic aspects between songwriting and traditional music theory are very much the same. It's the formal aspects of it, like how how many measures are within a section and how you move. That's one of the things that's very different. So often in more advanced music theory classes, you'll do a form and analysis class. Well, you'll look at different forms. Whether, you know, in most music theory 1 and 2, we'll touch upon sonata form, rondo form, the idea of parallel periods, contrasting periods, sentences. But there's usually music theory classes that go a lot more in depth that would cover things like song forms. So some of your traditional music theory books might have that, just kind of like in later chapters. But others might have separate books that are dealing with formal analysis of music. So hopefully that gives you a place to start. All right. And then we're going to call this our last question from Metalhead19. We've got, can you explain how to make a smooth voice leading between 1 and 2, 2 chord? I mean, all notes will be different, so how can you make those changes sound more pleasant? Thank you. Metalhead19, excellent question. I do cover this in one of my lessons, so if you go back and start going through lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's probably early on. It's I think lesson 5 or 6 dealing with voice leading. But let me do it again, because to be honest with you, this is where a lot of music theory folks make a mistake and get parallel octaves, parallel fifths. Now, with a name like Metalhead, I would imagine that how you feel about perfect parallel fifths is different than the way Bach would feel. Metal music loves parallel perfect fifths. And the idea is that the perfect fifth is so consonant that it really almost kind of blends together, so that it becomes like one power thing, or you know, people call it a power chord. The idea of power, just that fifth alone, is just like, it's the bare bones. It's so consonant. And so for Bach, he would not consider that two independent parts. He'd say that's just one thing. So when we talk about music theory and voice leading and smooth voice leading, we're recognizing that we want this independence of the different parts so they kind of ebb and flow together. And that's the nitty gritty. So if I were to say, we're in the key of C major, here's a 1 chord, I'm going to go to a 2 chord, right? So the smoothest voice leading was just to move everything up by step, right? And if we did that, we kind of have parallel everything. And if you're familiar with music theory, you know that parallel octaves, parallel fifths is something that's undesirable. You know, you got parallel octaves here, you got your parallel fifth here. And the reason it's undesirable, and this is important, right? Because in metal music, it's not undesirable. The reason it's undesirable is that it doesn't sound like these are individual melodic lines coming together to create harmony. And historically, coming out of the Renaissance, the music was focused on melodies that came together to create harmonies. And in the Baroque era, that really became solidified in the idea of the harmony lining up and being as equally important as the voice leading. It's like the combo of those two. Voice leading, smoothness, with way chords function in terms of the circle of fifths and harmonic function. So this kind of takes away the individuality of each one of these parts. For the bass, the tenor, the alto, and the soprano, you kind of like blend. You don't have your own melody. You're doing the same shape melody as everybody else. So keep that in mind, right? Parallelism can be used for great effect and be super interesting and super effective and sound awesome. It does not sound like individual parts coming together and create harmony, however. So if you are going for individual parts coming together to create harmony, you don't want to use this kind of parallelism. So to answer the question, instead of moving everything up by step, you move everything in contrary motion with the bass to the next note you can, right? So here we know we're going for D, F, A in our 2 chord. So if you have a G, the next chord going down, the next note going down would be an F. Here E, the next note down that we're going for would be a D, and here C, the next one down is an A. You'll notice that stepwise motion, leap of a third. So we step up in the bass, step down in 2 other voices, and leap down a third in the last voice. And that creates individual parts. You can say, well, Dr. B, these 2 are doing exactly the thing. They're going down by step. Yeah, but their interval between them is a major 6. And major 6 does not have the same consonants and blending kind of glue that the perfect fifth does. So the major 6 moving in parallel allows the individual parts to kind of retain their individuality in a way that perfect fifth, because of that blending consonance power, just the acoustics of it, does not allow for that. So what I wrote, we have, if we do the first one that I've already erased, you can hear this like this is like this kind of like, it's just a block of stuff. It sounds like block, shift, block. Where if we listen to this, it feels really different. It has this kind of like movement, like a contracting into itself. Let me do it again. So one of the things that metal music sometimes does extremely effectively is it uses this kind of perfect fifth power thing, which is very much like medieval music. So if you want to go back and check out some of that Guillaume Marchot and stuff earlier than that, if you like metal, you might like late medieval music as well. But a lot of metal music will have that as this kind of foundation, and then sometimes you'll do like a most or more Bach choral with traditional voice leading as a contrast or as a separate section. So like think of Ozzy Osbourne, Mr. Crowley with the organ introduction. And so you have this kind of combination of traditional voice leading to give it that kind of feeling of things ebbing and flowing and coming together, these individual parts that come together, create harmony, and then go apart but still creating harmony, as contrasted with the uniform block nature of like that parallel motion that you hear. So we're gonna have to wrap things up. Yeah, virtual Ray, 20th century harmony. Yes, sometime, not today. There's levels of complexity there. And certainly what I talk about in some of my lessons with the chromatic stuff is things you hear towards the end of the 19th century going into the 20th century. But there's certain things like polytonality, as done by people like Darius Milhaud, that are uniquely 20th century, and certainly 12-tone music of people like Arnold Schoenberg, along with Alban Berg and Anton Webern, something specifically 20th century. So that would be aspects that you could kind of get started on your own, but at some point I might touch upon. And then we're asking about, Joel was asking, yeah, Tonal Harmony by Stephen Kostka is the one I'm talking about. Shostakovich, question mark? The answer is of course. Shostakovich is amazing. I'm so super excited. Classes start for me tomorrow, and on Wednesday I have my orchestra rehearsal, and I get to conduct, because I choose the music, I get to choose what I want to conduct. Shostakovich, Fifth Symphony. I'm going to be conducting a movement from that. So excited. It's one of my favorite Shostakovich pieces. This Fifth Symphony is fantastic. Love it. So I think that's good. Got a couple last minute flurry of questions here. What do you think of people who say music theories are nonsense? I think some of them are. I think it depends on which music theory you're talking about. Have you ever heard the expression, "Oh, it's good in theory, but it doesn't work"? That's a nice theory, but it doesn't work. I've heard people say things like that. Oh, it was such a good theory, but it just doesn't work. And my response is always, well, then it wasn't a good theory, because good theories, eventually, you can figure out how they're going to work. But if you've tried and you've tried and you've tried and it doesn't work, it means it's a bad theory. So I would say that when we say music theory, we have to recognize that there's many different aspects of music theory, and some of it is absolutely super helpful, super important, and people who don't want to recognize that music theory, they want to label it nonsense, are usually the people who will also say something like, oh, I don't want to listen to too much of other people's music. It'll make me not be original. I want to be an original, so I want to come up with everything myself. And I usually point out to people who are saying that I kind of understand, like if you're the kind of person that's going to listen to something and then just imitate it, then yeah, if your personality is to be an imitator, then the more you expose yourself to, yeah, you're going to be imitating things. And when you are only exposed yourself to one thing, you're going to imitate that. But if you're the kind of person who listens to something and then absorbs it and like decides whether you like it or not, let's say you imitate one thing, 2 things, 3 things, 10 things, 20 things, 100 things, 1,000 things. At the point where you've listened and exposed yourself to 1,000 different things, and you're imitating 1,000 different things, there's just no way you cannot start filtering it through your personal likes and dislikes, and then you kind of come up with your own thing. So what I recommend is for people who are afraid of not being original, which is a legitimate concern because there's a lot of people out there who are just imitators. My recommendation is you avoid that by exposing yourself to everything and having an opinion. Allow yourself to say, I like this and I dislike that. There's music out there in the world that I recognize as well done, well constructed, and I don't like it. I allow myself that. And what that means is that after I've listened to so many thousands of different composers, styles of music, I can then put that all through the funnel of my likes and dislikes to come up with something that's uniquely mine. So for the people who think music theory, the kind of stuff that I often talk about, is nonsense, they're wrong. I think their fear is that they're going to imitate and be unoriginal. And I understand that concern, and I think I have a solution. On the other hand, there is some theory out there, like I said before, where people say it's good in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. In terms of music, that would mean that you have a theory that this will create music that people respond to emotionally. And if they don't respond emotionally, it may be that your theory is just not a good theory. It just doesn't work. So for a quick example, if I say, you know what, I'm going to pretend that consonances and dissonances are equally comprehensible. They're equal in all ways, and that dissonances can be treated as if they were consonances in all situations. And I go off and I compose music with that as a foundational concept of my theory. You're going to find that the reality of consonants and dissonances, whether you're pretending they exist or not, they do. And so you're going to have some real problems with any kind of music theory that has as its foundation something that's just not the way things work. And so in that sense, if you're talking about some aspects of music theory, yeah, some of it is nonsense. It's really easy to just start playing little mind games as if you're playing a complex Sudoku puzzle or whatever and say, oh, but isn't it, look at this relationship and this relationship, oh, and look, and then you're doing it all on paper, right? If you're doing all your music theory on paper, you can easily come up with music theory that's nonsense. If you are listening and you're trying to tie how the listening creates emotion and how it and why it works and what's the principles behind it, and you're taking into consideration acoustics and human psychology, then you're going to have theory that's not nonsense. Alrighty. Yeah, guys, lots of great questions. Thank you. I really appreciate this. This is a lot of fun for me to go back and forth. Please, I'm going to do this again. I think, just as a little heads up for those of you who made it all the way to the end, I'm probably going to be doing these Dr. B Music Theory live Q&As Sunday afternoons, probably around this time. Unfortunately, it might not be every weekend, not every Sunday. But that's general if you're kind of planning ahead. I announce it up, so if you subscribe for me on Patreon, I announce it ahead of time. Sometimes it's only a day ahead of time. Sometimes it's more than one day ahead of time when I'm going to have it, when I know for sure what my schedule is going to be and whether I'm going to be able to do that. So if you want a heads up, you always support me on Patreon and get a heads up. You can also submit a question ahead of time. For those of you who that doesn't work for, not a problem, no worries. I'm glad to have you. I just want to share my love of music and help you all learn something and be able to take that and use it in some kind of productive way and make music and make things more awesome. So keep an eye on Sunday afternoons and save your questions and come back in and let's spend another afternoon talking about the most awesome thing in the world, music theory. Thanks, everybody.